Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, welcome back. It's time for another deep dive. And today we're going to be tackling a really interesting question of the civil rights movement.
Okay.
You know how we always talk about the monumental impact of Selma in 1965?
Yeah.
Well, today we're going to be looking at what happened after that.
Interesting.
Did the movement lose momentum, or did it evolve and continue in new ways?
That's a great question. And, for a while, a lot of people actually thought the movement did kind of fizzle out after Selma.
Oh, really?
Why is that? Well, we've got some really insightful material from a history podcast called Mr. Hutchings History that sheds some light on this.
Okay.
They highlight the work of a historian named Adam Fairclough, who back in 1987 argued that the movement sort of fractured when it started tackling these bigger issues, like economic justice, for example.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I mean, going up against Jim Crow laws, that was pretty clear cut, right?
Right.
You could see the segregation. But how do you rally people around something as complex as economic inequality?
Exactly. It's a lot harder to mobilize people when the goals are less tangible. And to complicate things even further, this is also around the same time that you see the rise of groups advocating for Black power,
Right.
which represented a completely different approach compared to that earlier emphasis on nonviolence.
So you've got these different factions with different goals, and even figures like Martin Luther King Jr. were struggling to maintain unity.
Yeah.
Didn't he face pushback for speaking out against economic inequality in the Vietnam War?
Yeah, he did. It was definitely a challenging time, and from a certain perspective, it did seem like the movement was fragmenting. But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Even Fairclough himself later revised his views.
Really? What changed his mind?
Well, by 1995, more research had emerged, and Fairclough acknowledged that there was actually a continuity of protest, particularly at the grassroots level.
Oh, wow. So it's like the national spotlight moved on.
Yeah.
But in those local communities, the fight was still very much alive.
Exactly. And we've got another historian to thank for this insight, Stephen Tuck. His research on Georgia is incredibly insightful.
Okay.
And it reveals just how active groups like the NAACP and SCLC remained on the ground. They may not have been making national headlines,
Right.
but they were definitely making a difference.
I'd love to hear a specific example of what they were doing.
Absolutely. Let's look at the SCLC in Georgia in the early 1970s.
Okay.
They were super involved in community development projects, protests against police brutality, and they were actively fighting employment discrimination.
Hold on. So they were tackling those very issues of economic justice that Fairclough initially thought signaled the movement's decline.
Precisely. And remember Fairclough's earlier work about the movement struggling in the face of voter suppression?
Oh.
Well, he actually found that the NAACP saw a resurgence in Louisiana during the 1970s.
Interesting.
Black citizens there were organizing and pushing back against those tactics.
This is really making me rethink things. I guess it's easy to assume that once major legislation like the Voting Rights Act passed, that everything just magically changed overnight.
Right.
But it sounds like those discriminatory practices were still deeply embedded in many local communities.
You're absolutely right. And that's why the work of those local NAACP chapters was so vital. They were on the ground challenging those practices in court and advocating for real electoral reform.
So while the federal government played a huge role, it really took the ongoing efforts of those local communities to safeguard those hard-won voting rights.
Definitely. And this actually reminds me of something that the historians Lawson and Dudziak wrote about.
Okay.
They emphasize how it's really the vigilance of those on the ground that truly protects progress.
I love that. So the story is a lot more nuanced than just saying the movement disintegrated after Selma.
Yeah.
It seems like it went through this period of really significant change.
Yeah.
Maybe even an evolution.
I think that's a great way to put it. And speaking of evolution, we should probably talk about that shift from a focus on civil rights to a focus on economic rights.
Let's do it.
All right, so to understand this, we have to bring in historian Aldon Morris.
Okay.
His work is so helpful in understanding how this fight for economic justice was a natural progression for the movement. Think about it. After securing those essential political rights,
Yeah.
activists were able to turn their attention to the deep-seated economic inequalities that were still plaguing Black communities.
That makes sense. But as we've touched on already, economic issues are inherently more complex than just changing laws, right?
Yeah.
It's a different kind of battle.
Exactly. Instead of dismantling a single system like Jim Crow, you're talking about addressing something far larger, more systemic.
Right.
And that's probably why it was so difficult to get everyone on board with this new focus. It wasn't as straightforward as, say, a boycott or a sit-in.
But didn't this shift towards economic justice also lead to some interesting new alliances?
It did. We see Black activists starting to form coalitions with other minority groups.
Okay.
And even with some poor white communities recognizing that shared experience of poverty and neglect.
Wow, so the movement was broadening its reach and finding common ground with others who were facing similar struggles.
Exactly. And we can't talk about this period without mentioning Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People's Campaign in 1968.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Such a powerful example of this broader vision he had for social change.
Right.
He was calling for nothing less than a fundamental restructuring of the American economy to address poverty and inequality at their root.
A bold move for sure. And unfortunately, it faced immense obstacles, not to mention being tragically cut short by King's assassination.
Right.
But even so, it speaks volumes about how the movement was evolving to tackle those root causes of injustice.
It's amazing to think about how much was happening beneath the surface, even if it wasn't always making the headlines. And while we're talking about these key figures, we can't forget the essential role that Black women played in keeping this movement alive after Selma.
You're so right. Historians like Vicki Crawford and Barbara Ransby have done some amazing work highlighting this.
Yeah.
How as national attention waned, it was often Black women who were the backbone of those local movements.
Like Septima Clark and Ella Baker, for example. Incredible organizers.
Absolutely.
They were educating young activists, building these community networks, fostering this incredible resilience at the grassroots level.
And, Ransby actually quotes Ella Baker as saying that the movement didn't belong to any single prominent figure, but rather to all those individuals in those communities across the South who were fighting every day for a better life.
That's powerful. So we're seeing how the movement adapted, evolved, continued in all these different ways.
Yeah.
But we can't talk about this era without also addressing the rise of Black power, right?
Absolutely.
It feels like that adds another layer of complexity to this already complex story.
It definitely does. The late 1960s and early 1970s saw figures like Stokely Carmichael and groups like SNCC really starting to gain traction. And they were advocating for a different approach, one that emphasized self-defense, economic independence, Black pride.
And this was a pretty significant departure from those integration-focused goals of the earlier movement, right?
Yeah, it was. It was a reflection of the frustration that a lot of those younger activists were feeling.
Like change wasn't coming fast enough.
Exactly. They'd seen firsthand how slow and incremental that progress could be, and they were ready for something more radical.
It's interesting, though, because even as Black power was emerging as this powerful force, you still had those more traditional organizations like the NAACP and SCLC continuing their work at the local level.
Right.
So it wasn't necessarily a case of one approach replacing the other.
Right.
It was more like this coexistence
Yeah.
with different groups pursuing different strategies, but ultimately striving towards that same goal of racial justice.
It was a really dynamic and at times probably a pretty messy period.
Right. And that's what makes it so fascinating.
Definitely. You had these different threads of the movement kind of coexisting, sometimes bumping up against each other, but all contributing to this broader push for justice and equality.
It's like a tapestry with all these different colors and textures woven together
That's a beautiful way to put it.
to create something truly unique and impactful.
It underscores the fact that there never was a single monolithic civil rights movement.
Right.
It was always this diverse collection of voices, strategies, goals.
All united by that shared desire for change.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But also each bringing their own unique experiences and perspectives to the table.
And maybe that diversity was actually a source of strength. Maybe it allowed the movement to adapt to different challenges and connect with different communities in ways that a more homogenous movement just couldn't.
That's a really intriguing point. It's kind of like an ecosystem. The more diverse it is, the more resilient it becomes.
Okay, so we're seeing that the idea of the movement just simply disintegrating after Selma is way too simplistic.
Way too simplistic.
But there were definitely these tensions and these challenges during this period of transformation, right?
Oh, absolutely. And we can't shy away from those complexities.
Okay.
The rise of Black power, for instance, definitely caused friction within the movement.
Right. Not everyone was on board with that shift in tactics and philosophy.
Definitely. And, the nonviolent approach had been so incredibly effective in dismantling Jim Crow.
Yeah.
But for many, it hadn't really delivered that deep systemic change that they were ultimately looking for.
It's like, okay, you got the right to vote. You got the right to sit at the lunch counter.
Right.
But what if you can't afford to eat?
Exactly.
What if you're trapped in this cycle of poverty that limits your opportunities and keeps you from fully participating in society?
You're hitting on a crucial point here. The fight for economic justice wasn't just about achieving a better quality of life for Black communities.
Right.
It was about fundamentally reshaping American society.
To make it more equitable and just for everyone. And this was not an easy battle. As we've been discussing, addressing economic inequality is so much more complex than simply changing discriminatory laws.
Right.
You're talking about dismantling these deep-seated systemic issues that are woven into the very fabric of our society.
It's a challenge that persists to this day.
For sure.
But the fact that activists were already grappling with these issues back in the 60s and 70s shows just how far-sighted they were.
Yeah.
They understood that true liberation required more than just legal equality.
Right.
It demanded economic empowerment and a fairer distribution of resources.
So this is where we start to see the movement broadening its vision and building alliances with other groups who are also facing marginalization and economic hardship.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to see how the fight for Black liberation starts to intersect with other social justice movements.
It's all interconnected, and often the most effective path to lasting change is to recognize those shared struggles.
Right.
And to build coalitions across different communities.
And it's important to remember that this wasn't just some abstract philosophical debate.
Right.
This was about real people's lives,
Absolutely.
about addressing the very real needs of communities that were being denied. Access to quality education, decent housing, economic opportunities.
And the activists who were leading this charge weren't just intellectuals or politicians.
Right.
They were organizers, educators, community leaders who were deeply rooted in the places that they were fighting for.
Right. They understood those day-to-day realities of poverty and discrimination.
Excellent.
And they were dedicated to creating tangible change.
And it's amazing to think about the courage and resilience it took to keep fighting even when the national spotlight had moved on.
Yeah.
Even when they were facing resistance and backlash.
It's a powerful reminder that real change often starts at the grassroots level.
Absolutely.
Driven by people who are truly invested in their communities and determined to build a better future for everyone.
Definitely. And it's a reminder that we all have a role to play in creating that better future.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Whether we're on the front lines of social justice movements or simply trying to be more informed and engaged citizens, we can all contribute to building a more just and equitable world. So if we kind of zoom out and look at the big picture, can we definitively say that this idea that the civil rights movement disintegrated after Selma is just plain wrong?
I think it's safe to say that that's a gross oversimplification of what was a very complex and dynamic period.
Okay.
Yes, the movement changed, it evolved.
Right.
But change doesn't equal failure.
Right.
In fact, you could argue that this period of transformation was essential for the movement's long-term impact.
I'm starting to see that.
Really?
It's like the movement was a seed that was planted during those really intense years of the early 1960s.
Yeah.
And then after Selma, those roots started to spread out in all these different directions.
Right.
Nourishing new growth and creating this more expansive and resilient movement for social change.
I love that analogy. That's beautiful. It really captures the essence of what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
The movement didn't die. It dispersed. It adapted. It found new ways to flourish.
So if someone were to ask you to sum up the most significant takeaway from this period, what would you say?
Oh, that's a tough one. There are so many important lessons to be learned.
Right.
But I think one key takeaway is that progress is rarely ever linear. There are going to be setbacks, there will be course corrections, there will be internal debates and disagreements.
It's like that saying the only constant is change.
Exactly. And the civil rights movement is a perfect illustration of that.
Yeah.
And instead of viewing these changes as signs of weakness or failure, we should recognize them as evidence of the movement's adaptability and its resilience.
Right.
It's a reminder that we need to be flexible.
Yeah.
We need to be willing to adjust our strategies.
Right.
And we always need to be open to new ideas and new perspectives.
So the movement didn't disintegrate, it transformed. And while there were certainly challenges and divisions during this period, it also seems like there was this incredible surge of creativity and innovation.
Yeah.
And this really powerful commitment to building a more just and equitable society.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this period so incredibly inspiring.
Yeah.
Even in the face of such adversity, even when the odds seemed stacked against them, those activists never gave up hope.
Right.
They kept pushing forward, they kept experimenting, and they kept fighting for a better future.
Okay, so we've talked about how the movement adapted and how it evolved.
Right.
But let's just circle back to that question of disintegration for a moment.
Okay.
Because even if we reject that overly simplistic narrative, there were definitely some tensions and some very real disagreements within the movement during this time, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
And it's important not to shy away from those complexities. The rise of Black power, for example, caused some real friction within the movement.
Right. It was this major shift in tactics and philosophy that not everyone was comfortable with.
Right. And it's understandable that there would be pushback, especially from those who had been at the forefront of the movement for so long
Right.
and had seen the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance firsthand.
It's also really important to understand the context in which Black power emerged.
Absolutely.
For a lot of those younger activists who had grown up seeing the limitations of that incremental progress and that nonviolent approach, while undeniably powerful in dismantling Jim Crow,
Right.
it hadn't really delivered that radical economic and social transformation that they were seeking.
They were impatient for a more complete liberation.
Exactly. And they saw Black power as a means to achieve that.
Exactly. It was about reclaiming agency, asserting self-determination, and demanding more than just a seat at the table. They wanted to change the table itself.
And it's interesting, though, because even as Black power was gaining momentum, you still had those more traditional organizations like the NAACP and the SCLC continuing to do this incredibly important work at that local level. So it wasn't a case of one approach replacing the other. It was more like this coexistence.
Exactly.
With different groups pursuing different strategies, but all ultimately working towards that same goal of racial justice.
That's what makes this period so fascinating. You have these different strands of the movement operating simultaneously, sometimes clashing, sometimes complementing each other, but always contributing to this broader tapestry of resistance and social change.
It's like this multifaceted movement with different groups utilizing different tools and tactics to address the multifaceted nature of oppression.
I like that.
And it's a reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to social change.
Definitely.
What works in one context might not work in another.
Right.
And it's often the diversity of approaches that leads to the most lasting and meaningful transformation.
I couldn't agree more. And I think the fact that we're even having this conversation today is a testament to the enduring legacy of the civil rights movement. It's not just some chapter in a history book. It's a living, breathing force that continues to shape our understanding of justice, equality, and the power of collective action.
So even though the movement didn't disintegrate after Selma, did it fragment? With all these different groups and approaches, did it lose that sense of unity and purpose?
That's a great question. And I think it's one that historians are still grappling with. There's no easy answer. On the one hand, you could argue that the emergence of Black power and that shift towards economic justice did create some divisions within the movement. There were disagreements about strategy, about goals, about the best way to achieve lasting change.
And sometimes those disagreements led to tension and conflict, right?
Absolutely. But on the other hand, I think you can also argue that the movement's diversity was actually a source of strength. It meant that there were more people involved, more ideas being generated, and more avenues for change being pursued.
It's like having multiple fronts in a battle.
Exactly.
You might not always agree on the best tactics,
Right.
but you're all working towards the same ultimate objective.
Exactly. And I think the fact that the movement was able to adapt and evolve is a testament to its underlying strength and resilience. It wasn't this monolithic entity that crumbled under pressure. It was this dynamic and multifaceted force that was constantly changing and growing.
So instead of viewing this period as a time of fragmentation or decline, maybe we should see it as a time of expansion and diversification.
I think that's a really insightful way to look at it. The movement wasn't falling apart. It was spreading out, taking root in new soil and finding new ways to blossom.
And in doing so, it was laying the groundwork for future generations of activists and social justice movements.
Absolutely. The legacy of the civil rights movement, particularly this often overlooked period after Selma, continues to inspire and inform social justice movements today.
It does.
It's a reminder that change is possible. That even the most deeply entrenched systems of oppression can be challenged.
Absolutely.
And that ordinary people have the power to make a difference.
You know, it's really fascinating when you think about how much the narrative about this period has changed over time.
Yeah. For sure.
We've gone from this idea of a movement in decline to this much richer, more nuanced understanding of what was actually happening on the ground.
It really highlights how history is never static.
Right.
It's a constant process of discovery and reinterpretation. And thankfully, we have historians who are committed to digging deeper and challenging the conventional wisdom.
It makes you wonder what other stories are out there waiting to be uncovered. what other assumptions we might need to re-examine.
Right. That's what keeps history so interesting. It's not just about memorizing dates and names.
Right.
It's about constantly questioning and reevaluating our understanding of the past.
And in this case, it's given us a much more complete picture of the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
Instead of just seeing a simple rise and fall, we're seeing this incredible story of adaptation and evolution.
Absolutely. And I think it's a really powerful reminder that progress isn't always this straight line. It can be messy, it can be unpredictable, and sometimes it takes root in the most unexpected places.
You know, as we've been talking about all these different facets of the movement,
Yeah.
from local activism to the rise of Black power, that shift towards economic justice has really stood out to me.
Yeah, me too. It feels like such a pivotal part of the story.
Yeah, it does. And to really grasp the significance of this shift,
Right.
we have to remember the historical context.
Definitely. For Black Americans who had endured centuries of exploitation and oppression, achieving true equality didn't just mean dismantling the legal barriers of Jim Crow.
Right.
It also meant confronting those economic structures that kept them marginalized.
It's like, okay, you have the right to vote, you have the right to sit at the lunch counter,
Right.
but what if you can't even afford a meal?
Exactly.
What if you're stuck in this cycle of poverty that limits your opportunities and prevents you from fully participating in society?
You're getting at something really important here. The fight for economic justice wasn't simply about achieving a better quality of life for Black communities.
Right.
It was about fundamentally changing American society to make it more equitable and just for everyone.
And that's a battle that's still being fought today.
Absolutely. But the fact that activists were already grappling with these issues back in the 60s and 70s shows how ahead of their time they were.
Yeah.
They understood that true liberation demanded more than just legal equality. It required economic empowerment and a much fairer distribution of resources.
And this is where we see the movement really expanding its scope and building those alliances with other groups who were also experiencing marginalization and economic hardship.
Exactly.
It's so fascinating how the fight for Black liberation starts to intersect with other social justice movements.
It's a powerful reminder that these struggles for social justice are interconnected.
Yeah.
And that often the most effective way to create lasting change is to build coalitions across different communities.
Right.
And to recognize those shared struggles that unite us.
And it's so important to remember that this wasn't just some abstract philosophical debate.
Right.
It was about real people's lives.
Absolutely. It was about meeting the concrete needs of communities that were being denied basic necessities.
Right.
Access to quality education, decent housing, economic opportunities.
And the activists who were leading this charge weren't just these detached intellectuals or politicians.
No, they weren't. They were on the ground.
They were organizers, educators, community leaders.
Exactly. They were deeply rooted in the places they were fighting for.
They understood those day-to-day realities of poverty and discrimination.
Right.
And they were completely dedicated to creating that tangible change.
And it's amazing to think about the courage and the resilience it took to keep fighting, even when that national spotlight had moved on.
Yeah.
Even when they faced resistance and backlash.
It's a powerful reminder that change often begins at that local level,
Absolutely.
fueled by people who are deeply invested in their communities and determined to build that better future for everyone.
And it's a reminder that we all have a part to play in creating that future.
Absolutely. Whether we're on those front lines of social justice movements or just striving to be more informed and engaged citizens, we all have a role to play in building a more just and equitable world. So taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture, can we definitively say that the idea of the civil rights movement falling apart after Selma is just flat out wrong?
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that that's a really gross oversimplification of what was a very complex and dynamic period.
Okay.
Yes, the movement changed, it evolved,
Right.
but change doesn't automatically equal failure.
Right.
In fact, you could argue that this period of transformation was absolutely essential for the movement's long-term success.
Yeah, I'm really starting to see that. It's like the movement was this seed that was planted during those really intense years of the early 1960s.
Right.
And then after Selma, those roots start spreading out
Yeah.
in all these different directions, nourishing new growth and creating this more expansive and resilient movement for social change.
I love that analogy. It's beautiful. It really captures the essence of what we've been discussing.
The movement didn't die. It
Wow.
dispersed, it adapted, and it found new ways to thrive.
Exactly.
So if someone asked you to sum up the single most significant takeaway from this period, what would you say?
Oh, that's a tough one. There are so many important lessons to be learned.
I know, right?
But I think a key takeaway is that progress is rarely ever linear. You're going to encounter setbacks, you'll have to make course corrections, and there will be internal debates and disagreements along the way.
It's like that saying, the only constant is change, right?
Exactly, and the civil rights movement is a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
And rather than viewing those changes as signs of weakness or failure,
Right.
we should see them as evidence of the movement's adaptability and its resilience.
It's a reminder that we need to be flexible.
Right.
We need to be willing to adjust our strategies as we go.
Absolutely.
And we always need to be open to new ideas and perspectives. So the movement didn't disintegrate, it transformed.
Right.
And while there were certainly challenges and divisions during this period, it also seems like there was this explosion of creativity,
Yes, definitely.
innovation, and this really powerful commitment to building a more just and equitable society.
Absolutely. And that's what I find so inspiring about this period.
Yeah.
Even in the face of such adversity, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against them, those activists never gave up hope.
Right.
They kept pushing forward, they kept experimenting, and they kept fighting for that better future.
Okay, so we've talked about how the movement adapted, how it evolved.
Yeah.
But let's just circle back to that initial question of disintegration for a moment.
Okay.
Because even if we reject that overly simplistic narrative,
Right.
there were clearly tensions and some very real disagreements within the movement during this time.
Oh, absolutely. And it's important to acknowledge those complexities. The rise of Black power, for example, definitely caused some real friction within the movement.
Right. It was a significant shift in tactics and philosophy.
Yeah.
And not everyone was on board with it.
Definitely. And it's understandable that there would be some pushback, especially from those who had been so central to the movement for so long and had seen the power of nonviolent resistance firsthand.
But it's also crucial to understand the context in which Black power emerged.
Absolutely.
For many of those younger activists who had grown up witnessing the limitations of incremental progress,
Right.
that nonviolent approach,
Yeah.
while undeniably powerful in dismantling Jim Crow,
Right.
it hadn't really delivered that radical economic and social transformation that they were seeking.
They yearned for something more. They wanted complete liberation.
Exactly. And Black power was seen as a way to achieve that.
Exactly. It was about taking back control, asserting self-determination, and demanding more than just a seat at the table.
Right.
They wanted to redesign the table itself.
And what's so interesting is that even as Black power was gaining momentum, you still had those more established organizations like the NAACP and the SCLC continuing their vital work at the local level.
Yeah.
It wasn't about one approach replacing the other. It was more like this coexistence with different groups employing different strategies,
Right.
but ultimately working towards that shared goal of racial justice.
That's what makes this period so fascinating. You have all these different facets of the movement operating at the same time.
Right.
Sometimes they clashed, sometimes they complemented each other, but they were all contributing to this larger tapestry of resistance and social change.
It's like a multifaceted movement
Exactly.
with different groups using different tools and different approaches to address the multifaceted nature of oppression.
Right, and it really highlights the fact that there's no single right way to approach social change.
Right.
What works in one situation might not work in another,
Yeah.
and it's that very diversity of approaches that leads to the most lasting and meaningful transformation.
And the fact that we're even having this discussion today really speaks to the enduring power of the civil rights movement.
It does. It's not just a chapter in a history book.
Right.
It's a living, breathing force that continues to shape our understanding of justice, equality, and the potential of collective action.
So even though we can say that the movement didn't fall apart after Selma, did it become fragmented with all these different groups and all these different approaches? Did it lose that sense of unity and purpose?
That is a great question. And honestly, it's a question that historians are still debating today.
Yeah.
There isn't a simple answer. On the one hand, you could certainly make the argument that the emergence of Black power and that shift towards economic justice did create some divisions within the movement.
Right. There were disagreements about strategy,
Absolutely.
about goals,
Yeah.
about the most effective way to create lasting change.
And those disagreements sometimes led to real tension and conflict.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But you could also argue that the movement's diversity was actually a key strength.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It meant that there were more people engaged, more ideas being generated, and more pathways to change being explored.
So like waging a battle on multiple fronts.
Exactly.
You might not always agree on the best tactics.
Right.
But everyone is united in that ultimate goal.
Exactly. And the fact that the movement was able to adapt and evolve really speaks to its inherent strength and resilience.
Yeah.
It wasn't this rigid structure that crumbled under pressure.
Right.
It was this dynamic and multifaceted force that was constantly in flux, constantly evolving.
So maybe instead of seeing this period as a time of fragmentation or decline,
Yeah.
we should view it as a period of expansion and diversification.
I think that's a really insightful way to look at it.
Yeah.
The movement wasn't falling apart. It was branching out, taking root in new areas, and finding new ways to grow.
And in doing so, it was laying the groundwork for future generations of activists and social justice movements.
Absolutely. The legacy of the civil rights movement, and especially this often overlooked period after Selma, continues to inspire and inform social justice movements to this day.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible.
It reminds us that change really is possible, that
Yeah.
even the most deeply entrenched systems of oppression can be challenged, and that everyday people have the power to make a difference.
You know, it's amazing how much we've learned just by asking that simple question.
Yeah.
What happened after Selma?
Right. It really shows you how much more there is to the story than what we usually get in those overly simplified historical narratives.
And it makes you think about all the assumptions we make about the past. We get these big ideas,
Right.
but then when you dig a little deeper, you find all this incredible nuance and complexity.
Exactly. That's where the real learning happens.
Right.
In those little details, those different perspectives, those unexpected turns in the story.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the civil rights movement after Selma, what's the one thing you hope our listeners will take away from our conversation?
That's a good question. I think I'd want them to come away with a deeper appreciation for just how resilient and adaptable this movement truly was. It didn't end with Selma. It evolved. It transformed. And it laid the groundwork for so many of those social justice movements that came after.
Yeah, it's like those activists were always learning. They were adjusting. They were finding new ways to fight for justice and equality. It's really inspiring.
It is. And I think it's a powerful reminder that the fight for social justice is always ongoing. It's not something that happened back then and is over now.
Right. It's something that we're all a part of, whether we realize it or not.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand history.
Yeah.
It gives us context. It helps us connect the past to the present, and it inspires us to keep working towards a better future.
Totally. And I think this particular period in the civil rights movement is so relevant for us today.
I agree.
When we see so many people rising up to challenge these systems of injustice and demand a more equitable society.
Yeah, it's like those activists from the 60s and 70s are passing the torch, saying, okay, now it's your turn.
I love that image.
Yeah.
It's definitely a call to action for all of us.
Right. We can't just sit back and admire what others accomplished. We have
Right.
to pick up where they left off and continue building that more just and compassionate world.
So what are some concrete ways we can do that? How can we apply the lessons of this period to our own lives and our own communities?
Well, I think a major takeaway is that power of grassroots organizing.
Yeah.
We saw that even when the national spotlight faded, those local activists kept the fight going.
They were the ones on the ground.
Exactly. They were challenging discrimination, advocating for reforms, and addressing those everyday realities of inequality.
So it's not just about waiting for some huge national movement to come along.
Right.
It's about taking action in our own backyards.
Exactly. Whether it's volunteering with an organization, attending community meetings, speaking out against injustice.
Right.
There are so many ways to get involved and make a difference.
And to remember that change doesn't just happen overnight. It takes time. It takes persistence. And it takes a willingness to keep learning and adapting along the way.
I got it. And it's about recognizing that we don't have to have all the answers.
Yeah.
Sometimes the most important thing is to just show up, to listen to those who are most impacted by injustice, and to be willing to work with them to create that change.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening for me. It's shown me just how complex and multi-layered the civil rights movement really was.
Good.
And it's made me realize that this wasn't just about a few famous figures or a few big events.
Right.
It was about this vast interconnected web of individuals and organizations who were working tirelessly, often behind the scenes, to create that more just and equitable world.
So well said. I'm glad to hear that.
And I hope our listeners are feeling the same way.
Yeah.
So to wrap things up, let's leave them with a thought-provoking question.
Okay.
How did these shifts and changes in the civil rights movement lay the foundation for other social justice movements that followed? And what lessons can we learn from this era as we continue to fight for equality and justice today?
Ooh, those are fantastic questions, and ones that I hope will inspire some deep reflection and meaningful conversations.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through history. It's been a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure as well.
And to all our listeners out there, Keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.